Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going into farm organizations because we have heard so much of it the last few days. Because of the fact that when they contacted my wife and I, we were in San Benito, Texas. So I had no chance to take no notes, to prepare no speech. So I'm going to go into what is a strike. What is it about? What's the feeling? What can be accomplished? Would you do it again? And can the young folks of today organize and have strikes? I think this is vital at this time because when I think back 50 years ago, at the time that I can remember taking eggs to the market and couldn't sell them, had to bring them home, feed them to the hogs. And when we shipped 3 cows with the Shipping Association, a week later we received a bill of $5 for freight. To the young folks here, this must seem impossible. But these things did happen, and I hope they don't happen again. Before I go into my talk, I'd like to mention this to the young people. I'm appealing. Don't give up. Never give up, regardless of how dark the days may look. We've got to remember we're under a system of exploitation. And as long as we're under a profit system, we are going to be exploited unless we, the people, do something about it. At this time, I would like to tell you a little bit about the strike in the 30s. How did we get participation among the people? As it was mentioned by your chairman, I was a member of the United Farmers League, very active in it and a director of it. It mostly was in the western states and organized among the poor of the poorest farmers. It was a very militant organization, and it had one thing in goal: we must save the family-type farmer. The other important factor was that I liked about it, it realized the consumer, the unions, the unemployed, the whole people of America that made up America. These are the people that buy our products, and without them we cannot get a price. With them we can accomplish everything. Another thing I'd like to bring out that I noticed up to this time was mentioned. At no time in the history of America has a farmer ever set the price of his commodities. He sells wholesale and buys retail. And under that kind of a condition, farmers cannot exist unless they're united together with all other groups in our society. How were we able to accomplish so many things in such a short time without the experience that which we had at that time? Remember, I was about 23 years old then. Mostly spent my life on a farm organizing farmers and cooperatives. We realized that if we were going to call a strike, we had to have the consumer with us. We also realized that if we wanted a price for our commodities, the unions had to have a fair wage. We have to realize people are important. All people of our society are important. We cannot just think of the farmers alone. We got to think of all of us as collectively as a group. So the first thing we did, first of all, I got to go back a little. I'm not a firm believer in Malorino. There was one guy who could call more strikes on and off again. It just depended on how his stomach felt the next morning. Just about the time you thought you were going out on a strike, he canceled it. The farmers became confused. They didn't know whether they should go on a strike or whether they shouldn't go on a strike. It did accomplish one thing. We found out that you cannot always believe a leader. Follow him when he's right, and when he's wrong, kick him out. And that was the same with Malorino. Only they forgot to kick him out. Through preparing for strikes and getting ready to keep our commodities off the market, we did learn one thing. We learned how to prepare ourselves. We also learned another, and that was prepare ourselves whether or not he was going to call it off. Finally, when the rank and file members of the Holiday Association and the United Farmers League and other organizations decided the next time a strike would be called, we would carry it on, and we did. We went to the unions. We asked them for their help. We went to the Unemployment Council. We asked them for their help. Remember now, that was 14 million people unemployed. That was an army of people. They needed something to eat. They needed clothes on their back. And we weren't going to deprive them of that. We went to the hospitals and asked them if they weren't going to get milk. We'd see to it that they got milk. We set up committees. We wanted to help the needy, people like ourselves. So when the strike was called, now remember, farmers are like other people. They may believe in a thing, but the question is, will they carry it out? When that stomach gets hungry, young children at home looking for food, they're desperate. Loyalty to them doesn't mean too much. So as we organize our group of people, remember all of this time, the old red herring was brought out, and everything time we did something different than what the establishment wanted us to do, or the leaders, the old red herring was always brought out, and it always will be. So as the strike started, most of the farmers did keep their commodities off the market. Finally, one or two would start hauling commodities to a cheese factory, to a creamery. Beef was being brought in to the wholesales. We decided that every crossroad in the neighborhood had to be picketed. I'm going to stop right here. Remember, we talked so much about women the other day. Let's give the United Farmers League credit. There was one organization said this is a family-type farm organization. Women and children are as important on the picket line as men. And they were on the picket line. When we went to jail, they went to jail. Can you imagine when the sheriff and the cop would see 10 and 12-year-old kids jailed? How that must have felt to them, but they had to take them. As we were organizing these strikes, as I mentioned before, trucks start to pile up miles and miles and miles back. Then they start going on the crossroads. And I can tell you one story that I know the lady. When she noticed trucks start coming down her road, what did she do? She pounded a couple spikes in the plank, walked out on the road and said, "I dare you to go over that plank, and I dare you to move it." Pretty soon she had truck drivers supporting her. I could go on and on and on. Tell you what people will do when they know there is a purpose and a cause to do it. Milk was being spilled. Now remember, let's get this straight. The farmers are not known as radical people or dangerous people. They're known as peaceful, loving people. And sometimes the things that which happened on the strike was not caused by the farmers, but those who hired others to do it. Those who went in and one or two cheese factories that were blown up. It wasn't the farmers who did that, but the finger was pointed to them. About a week or two later, first I'll have to finish this about milk piling up. The Unemployment Council, the labor unions, the cooperatives and whatnot were really, I just got started, got 5 minutes left. Okay, thank you so much. Were really loyal. They did their part. They came and got the milk. They took it to the people who needed it. They asked the people to come and help yourself if you wanted free butter, free cheese, free whatever we had. There's the truck. Go and help yourself. That's how we won people over. That's how you can win people over to, if you want another strike, don't spill it unless you're forced to. Give it to those that need it. I just want to say this. I have to close with this. After jailing some 23 kids, 2 of my brothers, 1 of my uncles, some of the others, can you imagine out in that country 3,500 farmers gathering the next morning, miles apart, 3,500, 8 o'clock in the morning, a march on to Neilsville. In closing, I just want to bring out this one point. They had the unemployed there with guns to shoot us down if we went through. Can you picture, we were marching 8 in a line, can you picture the first 8 who had to go face the group? I asked for volunteers. A lady said, I only have one life to give. For my family and for my farm. I volunteer. 8 of us in no time to wait. I looked back for miles and miles and miles and saw trucks waiting. We did march. When we came up to the line, what happened? Who got afraid? We were shivering in our boots. But these poor people threw down their arms and disappeared. All day long, through Neilsville, the trucks came rumbling in, demanding relief. 2 more things. The people were released. My brother was almost killed. I'm sorry. But they were released. The next day, the sheriff and the group let us alone. I could go on and on, but keep up the fight.
Thank you, Jack. Now we'll have Lowell Dyson speak. He's interviewed many of the farm strike participants and has a unique perspective as a historian.
I think it's tremendous to hear from someone who was an actual participant in the tremendous strikes of the 1930s. I think there's a great problem for all of us in this room. Either we lived through the Great Depression or we didn't. And we've got great problems either way. Let me give you a few examples of why I say this. In the fall of 1933, the great reporter Lorena Hickok was making a trip throughout the Midwest and West to report back conditions to Harry Hopkins, who was a federal relief administrator. And in one of her letters from North Dakota, she wrote of going into a relief office, and there was an elderly gentleman came in collegiate flannel trousers and a Yale letter sweater. And she started talking to him and asked him his story. His son, indeed, had been a football player at Yale, but when the Depression came, he had had to come home to the farm, and they were subsisting there on the farm. And why was the father wearing the Yale letter sweater? Because the two men had only one suit of clothes between them. And when one of them went out, only one could go at a time. The Des Moines Register, the paper that covers the state of Iowa, as it likes to say, the Des Moines Register began the year 1933 with a series of recipes in the newspaper telling its readers how they could get by living on shelled corn from the fields. And the first thing that you had to do in the recipes for shelled field corn was to cook it 8 hours on the stove. And most likely, what was that stove fueled by? That stove was fueled by field corn, because economists at Iowa State College of Agriculture had discovered in a study it was cheaper for farmers to burn their corn than to take it into town and sell it and buy coal. The Des Moines Register also told its readers that they should use cracked corn on their icy sidewalks rather than ashes or sand, because it was cheaper, and also when the spring thaws came, the corn would wash down into the streams and lakes and rivers and fatten up the fish, and people could catch them and supplement their diets. Gasohol is nothing new. The University of Nebraska, the University of Wisconsin, the Iowa State College of Agriculture, once again, all made studies on the efficacy of turning surplus grain into alcohol to be used in vehicles. In one county elevator, the sign was posted, "Number 1 yellow corn, 3 cents a bushel. Number 2 yellow corn, 5 cents less." The economics department of Iowa State College took off a whole several months from all of its other projects simply to study the effects of the Depression on farmers in Iowa. During this period of time, Jack has told us about a strike, the practical aspects of a strike. There were 2 major farm strikes throughout the Midwest. There was a threatened strike. He talks about Milo Reno calling a strike off. I want to get to that in a minute. There was a threatened strike. There were tax and mortgage and chattel sale stoppages by masses of people, sometimes amounting to crowds of 5,000 or more. There were marches on state capitals in which the chambers of the legislatures were taken over by farmers. There was the affair that's been alluded to by a couple of your speakers, in which a district judge was dragged from his chambers and nearly lynched. Some authors who have written about the farm holiday movement, and I'm speaking of a movement, have said this was a mindless rebellion of people who were revolting against they knew not what, nor for what purpose. And those writers are wrong. They knew what they were revolting about, and they had purposes. The position of the farmer in 1932 was desperate, and the condition of the poor farmer was bad. And I'm speaking poor economically, not poor in the sense of being a bad farmer. But you know, the condition of the so-called good farmer in many cases was even worse, because the 1920s was the decade of mechanization. It was the decade of the development of hybrid corn and so on. And farmers had gone, the good farmers, so-called, had gone deeply into debt to their insurance companies, their local bankers, and so on, to finance these changes. And now they found their corn selling for 10 cents a bushel or less, and they couldn't even pay the interest on their loans, let alone the principal. They couldn't pay their taxes, and they were up against the wall, baby. Now, I spoke of the farm holiday movement, and it was a movement because it encompassed a number of different organizations as well as ad hoc groups of farmers to meet an emergency situation. But in terms of formal organizations, I'm going to divide them up very briefly. Jack has mentioned the United Farmers League. If you want to start on the left, there was the United Farmers League and a United Front umbrella organization called the Farmers National Committee for Action. We have at least 3 people here today with us who were active in those groups. Jack in the United Farmers League, Clarence Sharp in the United Farmers League, and Lem Harris, who was the National Executive Secretary of the Farmers National Committee for Action. The United Farmers League wanted to agitate not only to save the family farm, but to educate the farmer to the necessity, in the end, for revolutionary change of the economic system in the United States. If you want to move over to the far right, there were a disparate number of organizations which, confusingly enough, called themselves the United Farmers of Iowa, Minnesota, and so on. It's confusing because there was a United Farmers League, which was on the left, but there was a United Farmers of Iowa and so on, who were on the right. And they were mainly organizations who thought the system was just fine, but had gotten into a little trouble, and what was needed was a sort of holding off of the wolf from the door. The wolf kept circling the house, but you had to keep him off from the door. There were a lot of leaders of this organization. Judge John Weirds up at Iowa Falls, Lars Scrommy, a state senator here from Story County, Spike Evans from up at Pocahontas, who later became Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, who was a rich banker and also a farmer, but who realized the necessity of organizing to prevent foreclosures, tax sales, and so on. And then, simply because it was the one that fell between the others, there was the largest organization of them all, the Farm Holiday Association. Gladys Baker the other day, I thought, was almost going to steal all of my thunder, but she told about the origins of the Farm Holiday Association, so I won't go into it. But the leader of the Farm Holiday Association and the man who pumped a tremendous amount of national publicity into it has been mentioned by Jack. He was an enigmatic character. He was a man of extremes, both in personal and in public life. Milo Reno was a man in his mid-60s already, who loved country music. He played the fiddle at country dances. He would go out to country churches and preach. He loved to preach. But he also loved fast cars, good whiskey, fine horses, and beautiful women, and the small farmer. He was charismatic. He was vituperative. He could get up on the stump, and he would pick someone out in the audience, like the distinguished J.S. Russell, farm editor of the Des Moines Register, and make him stand up and read him the riot act. Or he would pick out Lem Harris and say a few nasty words to him. He was oratorical, rhetorical. He was a spellbinding orator who could literally hold crowds for the hour. Well, Iowa farmers and other farmers had been hurting for a long period of time, but as Gladys said the other day, farm prices began to drop drastically after 1930. And so a delegation of Iowa farmers came to Des Moines in the spring of 1932 and organized the Farm Holiday Association. And during the summer of 1932, its organization spread throughout the Midwest. And in August of 1932, Milo Reno announced the first farm strike. Now, his theory and his motto and his slogan was, do nothing, buy nothing, stay at home, sell nothing. His idea of a strike was, in essence, the home holding action. But up around Sioux City, the prices of milk had fallen so low The group of dairy farmers were so desperate that they began a milk strike and they began picketing the highways, and within a week the farm holiday had joined in this picketing action, and there were 24-hour picket camps on every road leading into Sioux City. They set up their picket camps on the tops of hills so that the trucks would have to slow down. They used planks with nails in them for if anybody tried to speed through, or thresher machine belts with nails in them. The only thing they let through was moonshine or free milk for the children in the city. The strike spread to Council Bluffs, to Des Moines, to Minot, North Dakota, to a variety of other places, Kankakee, Illinois. There was violence. A cowardly group of Ku Klux Klan types led by the respectable banker in Cherokee, Iowa, drove through a meeting, outdoor meeting of the farm holiday up there like a group of Al Capone bankers, shooting into the crowd with shotguns and pistols. Well, the strike drew to a close as the cold weather came in 1932, but the farmers were moving on to an even more important action. Tax sales were coming up. Mortgages were coming due. And in the winter of 1932-33, that interregnum winter, while Hoover hovered in the White House and Roosevelt waited to get in, farmers by the thousands went to tax sales, and they forced any potential bidder not to bid. In Sioux City, 750 farmers crowded into a small room, and within 45 minutes, the entire tax sale, amounting to $750,000 of delinquent taxes, was cried, and not a bid was given. And this happened all over the Midwest. If farm mortgage sales were held, first the holiday people tried to stop them. People like George Warham from Mason City, who was chairman of the Cerro Gordo County Farm Holiday Association. People like Clint Haroldson and Roy Peterson, who were organizers in the Minnesota Farm Holiday, and I'm sure some of you might like to talk to all of these people afterwards, ask them questions. They tried to get the sheriff to not call the sale, and if he did decide to call the sale, then some big fellow like John Bush, the president of the Minnesota Farm Holiday Association, who was about 6'3" or so, simply tackled the sheriff and sat on him for the entire hour the sale was supposed to be called, and it never came off. And then there were the famous Sears Roebuck penny sales. Chattels were to be sold to settle debts. You've heard a little bit about this. These began in August of '32 and spread throughout the country like wildfire. A noose would be hung up to signify that this was going to be a penny sale. And what did that mean? When the individual items were sold, a milk cow would be sold for a nickel, a tractor for a quarter, a team of horses for 50 cents. The whole sale might go for $1.32. The debt had been legally satisfied, and then the bidders gave everything back to the original owner. Now, in the spring of 1933, I don't have time really to talk about the tremendous marches on the state capitals. Lem Harris led one in Lincoln, Nebraska. Milo Reno led one in Des Moines. They simply practically took over for a day or so state government, and they told the legislatures, we need a temporary surcease, we need a mortgage moratorium law. And in every state they got a 2 or 3 year moratorium where mortgage foreclosures were simply suspended. But some judges didn't exactly believe that this was constitutional, and they were differing in their interpretations. And Congress, who had come into session in March, was acting slowly on federal relief. Tempers rose, and in Primgar, Iowa, there was a battle over a foreclosure, and then in the same day, the people who had been in the battle in Primgar moved over to Lamar's. They went to the courtroom of Judge Bradley, who was not hearing a foreclosure case, but he was going to have some come up. And they stood up in the courtroom and they said, Judge, we want you to sign a pledge that you will not hold this law unconstitutional. He said, I can't make that pledge, boys. And so they leaped over the bar, they seized him, they dragged him down the stairs, they hauled him out to the edge of town, they put a noose around his neck, put it up over a signboard, and threatened to hang him. Local legislator and newspaper editor finally convinced the crowd not to do it. And in the end, they simply took his pants off, smeared him with grease, and made him, in an undignified way, walk back to town. Governor Clyde Herring declared martial law in 3 counties, and hundreds of farmers were thrown into concentration camps. The moratorium laws finally came through. Milo Reno threatened to strike in May of 1933, and 7 hours before the strike was to take place, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was rushed through finally by Congress, and under the advice of Governor Floyd B. Olson, the farmer labor governor of Minnesota, the strike was called off by Milo Reno. At literally the 11th hour, he called it off because they had achieved the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Reno was not completely satisfied because things were going so slow. And in October of 1933, he called a second strike, which was much less successful, but the second strike got the hot wires going. Clyde Herring was calling Henry Morgenthau, head of Farm Credit, by the hour and saying, the pickets are all over. You've got to do something. You've got to do something. Senator Lewis Murphy of Dubuque, who was the Democratic senator from Iowa then, was a shrewd man, and he told Roosevelt, you have got to give farm loans to these people or they're going to tear the state down. And within a couple of days, the Commodity Credit Corporation announced that it would loan to all farmers 45 cents a bushel for grain which had been selling for 25 cents a bushel. And Milo Reno's strike came to an end. Now, the farm holiday lived on for another 5 years, and that's another whole story. It never called another strike, but the potential was there if anybody would have acted up. And there were continual mortgage stoppages by the UFL and by the farm holiday throughout this whole period. They simply blocked them off. But the potential was there. If the federal government had failed in its actions, hundreds of thousands of UFL and FHA farmers would have turned out. This was no mindless rebellion. They knew what they wanted, and damn it, they got it through united action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lowell. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Charles Walters, or Chuck as we've known him for years. And his perspective as a journalist covering the NFO farm strikes hour by hour and minute by minute is pretty unique.
Thank you, Mr. Stoffern. I don't often call the Stofferns Mr. because I know your dad and his brother, and I knew your grandfather. I'm going to have to get that water. I'll admit it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry the crowd isn't bigger. I was real thrilled to hear the story of the farm holiday movement. I'd studied it some myself, but I can't recite the details as you can. I could do the same for the NFO, however. And I think maybe I can add a little insight and possibly a little personal recall to what I consider the prime oral history type of story that's still to be written in the United States. I knew this was no mindless rebellion, but there is sometimes a little mindlessness even in a rebellion that isn't mindless. I'll tell you a story about the great big Swede Ole sitting there in a farm meeting, and the spellbinder was telling them about how they were being done in by the trades and everybody else. And Ole jumps up and he says, "By gar, we'll kill him, I'll shoot him." And the speaker said, "Well, I'm getting a little far, you know, with this thing. Maybe I better cool him down." He says, "Wait a minute, Ole. Sit down a minute. You got to find out who to shoot first. Who to shoot is going to be a more difficult thing in the years ahead as we go into our next great crash than anything you'd ever dreamed of. Our police have been going around the world. They've policed up and found great new systems of control from Paraguay and Spain and Russia. It's not by accident that the women are led into the jail cell and stripped naked in legalistic rape, and the men likewise, all to protect the sheriff and his jailers. The Russians, under the early communists, found that if they stripped the man naked and had him standing around for hours and possibly days against a wall, they completely annihilated him. This is not a police procedure for any other reason than to control the people, to take away their spirit. If what you talked about would happen today, the juvenile officer would be there to seize the children immediately, and the women and children would be herded into the jail, and they would go in naked, with police procedure requiring them to have their hands cuffed behind their backs. We're in a different world. And I think this may be the reason that the NFO actions of 1966 and 67 and 68, didn't yield up the kind of incidents you recite about the 30s. It was a different ball game. You were dealing with a different constabulary. I mainly throw these in as prefatory remarks. I'm always a little reluctant to attend these kind of meetings. And yet, I seem to be irresistibly drawn to them. As you probably suspect, I'm really not at home in academic circles. I sometimes wonder if I should keep an anonymity when I go to a place like Iowa State or Ames, Iowa, and so on. I have a cultivated irreverence for footnotes and academic credentials. And I distrust the textbooks of history the way I distrust most bankers. I have about 100 volumes in my library on farm organizations. And somehow I think I'm still awaiting the real story, the way John Steinbeck would tell it, as he did in The Grapes of Wrath. Now, I first met up with NFO in a rather oblique way. It was 1958. I asked Earl Krause of Doane Agricultural Service to write a farm article for me for Veterinary Medicine Magazine, a publication over which I commanded the editorial pencil at the time. Now, Krause wrote in good, bright, optimistic homilies. He reflected essentially the philosophy of John Davis of Harvard, who coined the term agribusiness, contract farming, specification buying. My office was in the Livestock Exchange building down in Kansas City at the time. And in the aisles below, there were a bunch of overalled men, and there was talk about holding action. These men had been nurtured on the folklore of the Grange, the Alliance for Progress, and the farm holiday movement. And they reminded me a great deal of my dad. I can only remember once in my lifetime when my father cried. He sold the last of his workhorses. He was watching them being led away, possibly to a rendering plant. There was no feed. This was in the 1930s, the early 1930s. And I can remember those dust storms and those vintage cars rolling out of western Kansas on to California. And once in a while, a Maverick would roll east to Missouri. There was more at float than the dust storms, however. My dad knew what had been done to the farmer, and he knew why. But what he didn't know was how. Oh, he knew the apparent reasons. But some point before World War II, he says, "Son, I'd like for you to go to school. I'd like for you to dig into this thing. I'd like to know how before I died." He died at age 92, a year or two ago, and by that time I was able to explain it to him. and he understood. I've been concerned with farm economics, I guess, all my life. I was particularly interested in the holding actions of the NFO because I grew up on the stories of the dollar-a-week bulletins. In 1903, there was a man named J.A. Everett out in western Kansas. He told farmers to hold their crops until they got $1 a bushel. And it worked that year. And a year later, the dollar-a-week bulletin was asking for $1.20. And that's when trouble came. Farmers broke their necks to get to town to get a few cents more. Now, we had a saying in NFO, you can buy any farmer for 2 bits more. Well, NFO was not much more than any other farm organization at first. An organization of farmers who saw the middleman as the rascal who cheated them. An organization that had simple answers to complex questions. I have the baseball statistics in all this. They're of minimum interest, perhaps. You can find them in the few libraries that have a book called Holding Action. This is one that went through a flood. It's out of print. Not many libraries bought it. And the ones that I gave a free copy to criticized me because they didn't have footnotes. Now, just what is different about NFO? Is it just another organization unhappy with the cards dealt them in the game of life? Harry Graham of the National Grange once told me there had been not dozens, but hundreds of farm organizations characterized as national since the Civil War. And almost all have passed from the mind and memory of man. Now, these organizations often struck. They often wrecked trains, burned crops, bombed elevators, dumped milk. Moreover, there was the senseless example of the Depression, when Henry Wallace destroyed real wealth to increase money income. The final offering to the goddess of economics, supply and demand. Now, I'd like to answer my own question. Without the leadership wanting it, without the board of directors endorsing it, without many members understanding it, NFO became the repository of the most enlightened economic thought ever to come out of a farm organization. Shortly after the holding action in 1962, we got a man named Butch Swaim, came to Corning, Iowa, and he said it well and he said it all. Nothing is going to happen out there until something happens between the ears. Butch Swaim knew Carl Wilkin, and Wilkin was the surviving member of a fantastic triumvirate, the old Raw Materials National Council, which was composed of Dr. John Lee Coulter, Charles Ray, who was formerly with General Wood and Sears Roebuck, and of course Carl Wilkin. And while Henry Wallace was burning corn, and even before, when Milo Reno was hell-raising it out in Iowa, Coulter, Ray, and Wilkin were doing some rather remarkable probes of economic theory. They found that capitalism had in a built-in self-destruct, debt pretending to be earnings, and income compounding debt until the system exploded. They also knew, as the Russian Kondratiev knew, that capitalism had a self-correcting mechanism if left alone. But there were all these institutional arrangements, and institutional arrangements have never in the history of man let economics alone. These institutional arrangements sometimes pretended to serve people, but in fact they generally served the money interests and the power interests. And the only people who ever understood this really well in the history of the world were the founding fathers. But somewhere along the line, these lessons have been forgotten. And I think if you look carefully, you can see this self-destruct now operating. The Fed raising the interest rate to an unheard of height, 17%, figuring on 24%. Why, the idiots, don't they know the Germans raised interest 100% at a crack to cool inflation? and it roared straight ahead. Because interest in itself, interest is inflationary and feeds on itself. Now, the U.S. Constitution was adopted in order to establish for ourselves and our posterity a par economy. Subsection 5 of Section 8 of the Constitution requires the Congress to coin the money and regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and to fix standards for weights and measure. Have you ever wondered why those weights and measures are in the same place as money? Because money is a measure. And how can a measure function if it one day the inch is this long and another day it's this long? Or the pound weighs more in terms of specific gravity one day than it does the next. Or the butcher's thumb is added to the scale. The third act of the first Congress was a tariff law to prevent cheap foreign goods and debased foreign currencies from determining the value of American money. Now, I stated as a fact that the value of money cannot be regulated without par exchange for the raw materials of the earth. I can and I will support this thesis, and I think I support the thesis that NFO drew its nourishment for its finest hours from this reality. The first characteristic of any industrial society is division of labor. The moment farming became proficient enough to feed more people than there were people in that particular farm family, why, there's a spin-off of labor now free to follow other pursuits. And from that moment on, agriculture is diminished in the number of persons involved in farm production. But agriculture has the same economics to perform. The early economists all realized this. Say's law of markets said the division of labor sets up reciprocal markets for each of the divisions automatically. And of course, that's an absurdity. But if you had parity for raw materials as it enters into the system, then Say's law of markets is absolutely correct. Unfortunately, institutional arrangements, trading houses, banks, government itself have never been used to assure par exchange, but to enhance predatory business profits, or in the case of government social programs, to keep the worst effects of predatory profits from showing. The lack of par exchange, basically for farm raw materials, has short-circuited the system and kept the worst effects from showing. And to keep the worst effects from showing, government has institutionalized poverty with low-cost housing, relief check, food stamps. Government is the employer of last resorts, and not least with a cheap food policy. And yet, in macroeconomics, cheap food means hungry people. Now, I cannot understand why the farm groups, 400 of them since the Civil War, have missed the anatomy of all this. They do not understand so much the anatomy of barter power as primary production moves in the trade channels as they do the nature of man, the predatory rascal who shares them out. Now, I'd like to wind this up with a comment on NFO. It was Ornley Staley's fantasy that one day a holding action would be the spark that drew flame and spread across the country. He visualized farmers en masse joining this general strike, the way the shopkeepers in Afghanistan recently joined the general strike. And I've stood in hotel rooms and argued that this would not happen, that the policymakers had been too astute, that they had paced the rate of farm bankruptcy these many years, making it never too high or never too low to again bring on the Milo-Reno revolt. But Orrin Staley nursed that fantasy along, refurbished it, built on it, evangelized on the basis of it, and waited patiently for that day. And all the holding actions paid homage to this fantasy, and yet none were conducted and yet none were conducted with a higher rationale in mind. This has been the failure of the farm organizations. The man handed me a note, says, my time's up. Is it completely up, or can I take another 30 seconds or so, or 6? Huh? 2 minutes. My God, 2 whole minutes. Perhaps it's sufficient to note that the NFO was nevertheless a genuine movement, a disciplined movement. The early leaders probably were something less than Spartacus leading the gladiators. The farmers of the NFO era, perhaps of the American agriculture movement era, were truly sandbagged in the crap game of life. The great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "The education of a child begins 100 years before it was born." Well, the economics of education of the people in the countryside and in the cities began even further back. And in all those courses of instructions, there is little room for the exchange equation, or even the knowledge who makes the decisions that keeps the game called exploitation afloat. I'll just skip a few of my choicest paragraphs to satisfy your clock watching, because you're making me nervous. Okay? They don't understand these principles. Vincent Vickers said them. I've written several books explaining it. Holding Action is one of them. Angry Testament is another. Unforgiven is another that even states the proposition better. They're all out of print. I don't know where you would find a copy except perhaps in a library. But the Holding Action had its function. It took a group of farmers from ground zero to where they constructed a national organization, one with capabilities to be reckoned with. I'm sorry to say that these capabilities were sent down the tube when a man named Hubert Humphrey came to an NFO convention with a lot of rhetoric that was pure humbug. As a consequence, the leadership signed a consent decree. And on account of this consent decree, there will not be another Holding Action out of NFO. I could tell you about the hours of glory and bickering in NFO. And I can also tell you about the fact that I departed the scene before the grand movement descended into purges, mean infighting, and internecine strife. I could relate how it passed from an organization contesting middlemen to one that has become a middleman itself, living off checkoffs, hardly mindful of the greater game and the greater dimension that forever keeps farm parity and national solvency a 7 league stride away. Thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I ran over, young fella.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm watching the clock because we'll have more time to question them later, so all of you out there can ask questions for them. Our next panelist is Don Patterson from the American Ag Movement.
I feel like I'm holding a bigger deck here than I know how to hold. My own background in the American agriculture movement is a little different than others. I grew up on a family dairy farm. We milked 30 cows, and in the early 50s, as some of you may remember, was a hard time for dairy farmers. So my dad sold the herd, bought a small business in town, and reduced the size of the farm operations. So that when I graduated from college, the feeling was that there wasn't enough income in it for me to come back on the farm. So I spent 15 years doing other things in other places. I worked in Latin America for several years on an urban and regional development project down there, sponsored by the Venezuelan government, because they knew one day they were going to run out of oil and they needed to do something to make sure that their economy was ready. I worked in the state of Montana, and in 1973, the winter of 73-74, I was in Campbell County, Wyoming, when the oil companies came in and bid the price of farmland from $40 an acre in a matter of weeks up to $500 and $1,000 an acre. The only reason that didn't happen in southeastern Montana was that the populous farmers in that area who had owned their land from when their families first settled that area 100 years before knew that if it was worth that much to the oil companies, it was going to be worth more than that much to them. And I knew, because I studied the energy situation at that time, that the use of fossil fuels had its limits, and that the only real hope we had was in the renewable resource energy, a lot of that in the hands of our American farmers, who were holding the last resource of this country that hadn't fallen into concentrated control. These are things that I knew as we started in 1977 in the fall to form the American agriculture movement. By that time, my dad had died back in Virginia, and I'd gone home to try to see if I could hold together what remained of a family farming operation that had become in even worse shape in the latter years of his life. And I knew, because of my background in economics, that we weren't just facing an individual problem across the country, but we were facing, as a result of the cost-price squeeze, a problem for all of us. And so I hadn't made the investments that probably by now would have me down the rat hole. I got involved in the movement because I thought it was important for the whole nation. I wasn't just protecting my own operation. And so I wasn't subject to the charge of being a greedy farmer, just trying to make a bigger handout for myself. The American agriculture spread across the country like prairie fire. The strike, from my point of view, was not the major part of it. It was really the hook, the symbol of our coming together. We had hopes, but we soon learned, those of us who didn't suspect it from the outset, that the only vehicle of getting something done was going to be government. The change in the federal policy that had the squeeze on agriculture and was transferring earned income into credit, so that we were rising now up to $160 billion of net farm indebtedness. Out of the $30 billion that the USDA calls net farm income, $14 billion today is required just to pay the interest on the farm debt. City people talk about how they pay out tax money to support farmers. The fact is that the situation has been the precise opposite. This country has been built on the backs of American farmers, and policy process that is stolen from the farmers for the benefit of the concentrated interests. American agriculture movement is not now, and never has been, a concentrated, hierarchical kind of an operation. People rose up around the country that never thought they had the capability to stand before an audience and speak. They rose up and did a job because they saw the job was there and somebody had to do it, and they knew more about what was going on than anybody else, and so they rose to the challenge. We're proud of the fact that we don't have any one leader, that we have leaders everywhere there's a farm community that sees that there's a problem and something needs to be done about it. And we've been the strongest in those areas where the women and the men have done the job together. And I'd like to recognize one person right here in the audience who arrived last night who's been a key leader in the state of Minnesota, Ann Canton. probably ought to be up here instead of me. I'd like to thank Gilbert Fite for going through the chronology of what we were about, because I'd like to stick to the substance. But before I do that, I come from the Plains, Virginia, and 100 years ago, in 1875, there was another national farm leader who came from the Plains, Virginia. He was a Colonel Robert Beverly, and he was elected in 1879 president of the Farmers' Congress, meeting in Louisville, Kentucky. And he writes of that organization, which was founded in 1875, as this organization was the first serious effort to organize farmers of the United States for the purpose of influencing national legislation. That's right in the tradition of what American agriculture is all about. And some of the things that he said then, and he has published in the History of the Farmers' Alliance, some things that might have well been written in the last couple of years. I'd like to read you just a little bit of what he said. Everything which can affect the dignity and prosperity of agriculture is a subject of national importance and is entitled to respectful attention of the government, so vauntingly declared to be the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and yet the fact is utterly and scornfully ignored that the tillers of the soil are a clear majority of all the people. We are not a majority anymore, as we all know, but the problems then were the same as they are now, to wit. The ultimate aim and purpose of the National Agricultural Congress is twofold. First, to arouse agriculturalists themselves to a realization of this great fact, and secondly, to enforce the recognition upon the representatives of the people who have been delegated to administer the state and national governments. It is a fact which admits to no dispute that no prominent and influential statesman in any department of the national government either possesses or apparently desires to possess even superficial knowledge of agriculture in any of its aspects, relations, or interests. The great business by which the majority of the people live and through which all have their bread is practically unrepresented in any department of the people's government. In the executive branch, they have a commissioner who ranks with only the clerks of other departments. In the Senate, they have one, and in the House of Representatives, 27 members in a body that of more than 300.